1. The lonely man. Snow was falling heavily that morning. Gentle flakes landed on Thomas's shoulders and his graying hair as he slowly walked along the winding path of the park. This was his routine every day for the past 3 years. Rain or snow, sun or storm. He had nowhere to go and no one waiting for him. His quiet footsteps echoed the state of his life. Still broken and utterly alone. Thomas used to be someone else. A dynamic man full of energy. For over 20 years, he worked in tech, eventually becoming the chief technical officer at a well-known software company in Frankfurt. Life was busy, but it had meaning. Every evening, he'd return home to Elena, his wife, a literature teacher with a gentle spirit and boundless compassion. She used to tease him for being a machine that learned how to love. Stiff on the outside, warm on the inside. They never had children, but they didn't feel the lack. Until that day, Thomas remembered it too well. It was a March afternoon. His phone rang during a business meeting. A frantic voice, an accident, hospital, urgent. When he arrived, it was too late. Elena had died, hit by a truck that had lost control on her way home from school. Everything collapsed. Thomas didn't scream, didn't cry. He just stood frozen in the hospital hallway, clutching her handbag. Inside were student essays to grade and a handkerchief he gave her last Christmas. He never returned to work. He withdrew from friends. The apartment grew silent and cold, like a mausoleum. Thomas started packing up Elena's things, but couldn't follow through. Every object held a memory, and he couldn't bear to let go. Her favorite mug, the soft sweater she wore in winter, they all remained. He moved to the couch, unable to sleep in their shared bed. Time passed, but nothing healed. People say time mends all wounds, but to Thomas, time only deepened the emptiness. He began walking every morning to keep himself from collapsing completely. Sometimes he would sit at the cafe Elena once loved, order a sugar-free cappuccino, just the way she liked it, and stare out the window, pretending she was simply running late that day. That morning, as snow blanketed the benches of the quiet park, Thomas sat with his usual coffee, gripping it tightly for warmth. A gust of wind slipped down his collar, snapping him back from memory. He sighed and looked around, and that's when he saw the boy, a small, frail figure curled up near the edge of the path, trembling like a fallen leaf in the harsh winter wind. The boy sat with his head down, hugging his knees, eyes vacant, eyes far too old for a child that young. Thomas stood, something stirring in his chest. It was Elena's voice, echoing in his memory. We don't get to choose who walks into our lives, but we do choose how we treat them. That morning, in the stillness of winter and the silence of his broken years, Thomas took a step toward the boy, perhaps toward healing himself, too. The Winter Coat, Part 2, Encounter with the Strange Boy. Thomas hesitated for a moment, his hand still holding the warm coffee cup, as the boy remained hunched under the bench, vulnerable and exposed to the elements. Something about the way the boy seemed to be waiting for something or someone made Thomas feel a sense of responsibility, or perhaps guilt, a feeling he had long forgotten. He set the coffee down on the bench beside him and took a step closer. The boy barely moved, his face hidden beneath a tangled mess of dark hair, his thin shoulders trembling against the cold. He wore a coat that seemed far too thin for the snow-covered streets, a faded, patched-up garment that looked as though it had seen better days. He didn't look up at Thomas as he approached, but instead stared down at the snow, as if it were the most interesting thing in the world. "Are you all right?" Thomas asked gently, his voice softer than he intended, as if the wind had carried his words with more weight than he felt. The boy's head snapped up, his eyes wide and wary, reflecting a life of hardship far beyond his years. For a moment, there was a tense silence, and then the boy spoke, his voice quiet but firm, like a whisper carried by the wind. "I'm fine," he said, but the tremble in his voice betrayed him. Thomas crouched down to his knees, tried to appear less imposing, his gaze softening. "You don't look fine. You should be inside where it's warm." The boy's eyes flew to the coffee cup on the bench, the steam rising gently from the mug. He glanced back at Thomas, his expression hard to read, but there was a flicker of something. Perhaps hunger, perhaps curiosity. "I'm not hungry," the boy muttered, his gaze dropping back to the snow. Thomas felt the pull of something familiar, something old and buried deep in his heart. He thought of Elena, of the warmth she used to bring to moments like this. She would have reached out, extended her hand, and offered the boy kindness, a chance to forget the cold for just a while. Thomas had forgotten what that felt like, to care for someone, to have someone rely on him, but he couldn't forget her voice. Her quiet insistence on compassion, on connection. You don't get to choose who walks into your life, but you can choose how to treat them. His breath caught in his throat as he realized that, in some strange way, this boy had walked into his life. He reached for his coat pocket and pulled out a scarf. One of Elena's scarves, the very one she had worn during their last winter together. He had kept it, folded neatly in his drawer, for reasons he couldn't fully explain. "I have an extra scarf," Thomas said, holding out toward the boy. "You can have it. It might help you stay warm." The boy stared at the scarf as though it were an object of immense importance, but he didn't reach out for it. Instead, he looked up at Thomas with wide, wary eyes, and then asked a question that made Thomas's heart skip a beat. "Why do you care?" The boy's voice was like a gust of wind, sharp and full of emotion that Thomas couldn't quite place. "You don't know me." Thomas blinked, taken aback. Why did he care? He could have easily walked away. He could have pretended not to see the boy, as many people might have. But something had stirred in him, something that felt too familiar, as if guided by some invisible force. Thomas found himself sitting beside the boy on the bench. For a few moments, they sat in silence, the only sound being the soft fall of snow and the distant hum of the city. The boy seemed to settle slightly, as if the presence of anyone had soothed him, if only for a moment. "I used to care about people," Thomas said quietly, as though speaking more to himself than to the boy. The words seemed to come out unbidden, as though they had been locked away inside for a long time. "I had a wife once. Her name was Elena. She was kind like you." The boy turned to him, curiosity sparking in his eyes now. "What happened to her?" Thomas felt a lump form in his throat, and he swallowed hard. It was strange, talking about Elena again. He had tried so many times to push the memories away, to lock them in a box he didn't have the courage to open. But now, with this boy sitting beside him, the box seemed to crack open, spilling out memories like a flood. "She died," Thomas said, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. "She died in a car accident 3 years ago. I haven't been the same since." The boy didn't say anything, but the silence that followed was heavy with understanding. Thomas could feel the weight of his own grief pressing down on him again, the aching emptiness that had haunted him for so long. The memories rushed back, sharp and vivid. He remembered the night before the accident, how Elena had smiled at him across the dinner table, her eyes full of warmth and hope. She had spoken about a trip they were planning, a vacation they had been dreaming of for years. She had laughed, touching his hand gently, and told him, "Don't worry, Thomas. We'll have all the time in the world together." That night, after dinner, he had gone straight to his office to finish some work. Elena had kissed him goodnight, as she always did, and when he looked up from his desk to wave her off, she was already gone. Thomas squeezed his eyes shut, fighting the tears that threatened to spill. He hadn't allowed himself to cry in so long. For 3 years, he had carried the weight of her absence, quietly retreating from the world as if he could escape the pain. But he couldn't escape it. It was always there, lurking in the background, waiting to remind him of what he had lost. "I don't know how to be happy anymore," Thomas whispered, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to move on." The boy's eyes softened. For the first time since they had met, he seemed to understand. He slowly reached out and took the scarf from Thomas's hand, wrapping it around his neck. "You don't have to move on," the boy said quietly. "Maybe you just need to start again." Thomas looked at the boy in surprise. His words, simple yet profound, struck a chord deep within him. Start again. It seemed impossible, but in the boy's voice there was a quiet kind of wisdom, a knowing that seemed far beyond his years. Perhaps it wasn't about moving on at all. Perhaps it was about letting go, about allowing himself to be vulnerable again, to care, to connect. It wasn't a promise that everything would be okay, but it was a reminder that there was still time. Time to heal, time to change, time to find new ways to be whole. Thomas sat back, feeling a small sense of peace settle over him. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about the past or the future. He was simply here in this moment with the boy who had crossed his path. And somehow, in that quiet, snowy park, it felt like the world had opened up just a little bit wider. The Winter Coat, Part 3, The Coat and the Hidden Pain. As the wind howled and the snow continued to fall in a gentle flurry around them, Thomas sat on the bench, his thoughts swirling in the same storm that surrounded him. He wasn't sure why he felt so compelled to share his past with this boy, this stranger, but somehow it felt necessary, like an old wound that had never healed, now opened by a simple question. The boy, still wrapped in Elena's scarf, seemed to sense a shift in Thomas's mood, though he remained silent, allowing the older man the space to speak. Thomas's eyes fell to the faded winter coat the boy wore, a strange, tattered thing that had clearly seen better days. The coat seemed so out of place against the pristine, snowy landscape, much like the boy himself. A thought tugged at Thomas's mind, faint but persistent. The coat, it reminded him of something deep in his past that he had buried long ago. Without thinking, Thomas reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, old photo. He held it in his hands, staring at it as though the image would hold the answers to the questions swirling in his head. The photograph was worn, the edges frayed, the colors faded with time. It was a picture of Elena, smiling at him in their old apartment. She wore a coat, the very same coat that the boy was now wearing. A rush of memories flooded back. Images of Elena, vibrant and full of life, laughing and joking with him. They had bought that coat together, during their first winter in the city, when they were still young and naive about the future. Elena had insisted on buying it, even though Thomas thought it was too expensive. "I deserve to be warm," she had said with a playful smile, wrapping herself in the thick fabric as they left the store. The coat had become a symbol of their early days together, of a time when everything seemed so full of promise. Elena had loved that coat, loved the way it made her feel cozy and protected. And when she had worn it, he had always felt safe. It had been a constant in their life together. But now, to see it on this boy, this stranger, felt like a cruel twist of fate, like a connection to a past that was slipping away from him with every passing day. Thomas closed his eyes, the memory of that first winter with Elena still fresh in his mind. He could almost feel the warmth of her hand in his, the softness of her voice as she had whispered her dreams to him late at night. "We'll always have each other, Thomas, always." But that was before everything changed. The pain of loss surged in his chest, and he fought to keep the tears at bay. He had been carrying this grief for so long, burying it under the weight of daily life. But now, with the boy sitting next to him, it all came rushing back, uninvited, unstoppable. He had spent so much time trying to avoid the pain, to keep it locked away in a corner of his heart, but it never truly left him. Not when he saw a coat that Elena had worn. Not when he heard the soft voice of a child who reminded him so much of his own innocence before the world had stolen it away. The boy, noticing the shift in Thomas's demeanor, looked up at him, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "It's okay," he said softly, almost as if he could read Thomas's heart. "You don't have to pretend." Thomas looked at him, startled. How could this boy, this stranger, know the depth of his pain? How could he possibly understand what it was like to lose someone you loved so deeply, so completely? But there was something about the way the boy spoke, something about the stillness in his gaze, that told Thomas this wasn't just an ordinary child. This was someone who had known suffering, someone who had seen the world in its rawest, most painful form. For a moment, Thomas considered telling the boy everything. The full story of how Elena had died, how he had been consumed by grief, how he had withdrawn from the world, how he had lost himself in work, in distractions, in things that never mattered. He had forgotten what it felt like to be alive, to truly live. All he had left was the emptiness, the hollow shell of a man who had once known love. But before he could speak, the boy's voice cut through his thoughts again. "I used to have a coat like that," the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper. He reached up and tugged at the fabric of his own worn-out coat, pulling it tighter around his small frame. "It was my mom's. She gave it to me before she left." The words hit Thomas like a punch to the gut. He turned to look at the boy, really look at him for the first time. The sadness in the boy's eyes mirrored his own, a reflection of the pain that came from losing someone you loved. The boy didn't elaborate, but his words spoke volumes. Thomas didn't need to know the specifics to understand. Loss was universal. Pain was universal. Thomas's heart ached for this boy. For the first time, he felt a deep, unspoken connection with him. The coat, Elena's coat, no longer seemed like a cruel reminder of what he had lost. Instead, it felt like a bridge between them. Two people who had known love and loss, who had been broken by life's unpredictability. The boy's words were a reminder that grief didn't have to isolate you. There was a strange kind of comfort in knowing that others had walked through similar darkness and had found a way to keep moving. The boy shifted slightly, pulling the scarf tighter around his neck, and glanced at Thomas with a look that was more mature than his years. "I don't think we ever really get over it," he said softly, as though speaking to himself. "The ones we love never really leave. They just change." Thomas swallowed hard, his chest tightening. The boy's insight was more profound than anything Thomas had heard in years. The idea that the ones we loved didn't truly leave, that they changed and stayed with us in some form. Thomas had never considered it that way. But somehow, in this moment, it made sense. Elena was gone, but she wasn't truly gone. She was in his heart, in his memories, in the coat the boy wore, in the quiet moments when he allowed himself to feel again. He glanced at the boy, who was now staring off into the distance, lost in his own thoughts. Thomas took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his grief shift, just a little. There was no simple answer, no quick fix for the pain he had carried. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was room for healing, room to let go of the past and start anew, one small step at a time. "Thank you," Thomas said, his voice raw but sincere, "for reminding me." The boy looked at him, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "It's just the way things work." And for the first time in a long while, Thomas believed it. The winter coat, Part 4, the days after. The days that follow were not filled with grand revelations or dramatic turns. Instead, they unfolded quietly, like the slow melting of snow after storm. The boy, who had come into Thomas's life so unexpectedly, remained a quiet presence in his routine. He showed up again the following day, and the day after that, often sitting at the same bench by the park, wearing the same worn coat, but his presence no longer felt as strange. It felt familiar, as though they had been destined to meet, to share a moment of understanding that could only be forged in the depths of shared grief. Thomas, at first, had kept his distance, unsure of how to proceed. But after their conversation about Elena's coat, a subtle shift had occurred. His heart, which had been a locked vault for so many years, began to open just a crack. He no longer viewed the boy simply as a reminder of his pain. He saw him as a fellow traveler, walking through the same storm of life. Thomas found himself beginning to wait for the boy's visits. The silence between them was comfortable now, a quiet companionship that didn't demand words. In the evenings, Thomas would sit by his window, watching the boy walk down the street with the same tattered coat wrapped tightly around his thin shoulders. There was something hauntingly familiar in the boy's gait, the way he moved through the world with a grace that suggested both loss and resilience. Thomas had never really stopped to observe anyone like this before. He had been too consumed by his own sorrow to notice the small, beautiful things. But now he noticed the way the streetlights cast long shadows on the ground, the way the snow crunched beneath the boy's boots, the way the world seemed to pause for a moment, just long enough to allow them both to breathe. It was during one of these quiet moments that Thomas remembered something he had almost forgotten. The day Elena had left him. It had been winter, too, a cold, gray morning that had promised nothing but more heartache. Elena had packed a small bag, telling him she needed some time. Time. Those two words had hung in the air like a sentence. He had tried to stop her, beg her to stay, but she had been resolute, her face set in a way he had never seen before. There had been no argument, no shouting, only a calm, almost attached goodbye. "I'll be back, Thomas," she had said softly, her voice breaking as she reached for his hand. "But you have to understand, I need to find myself again. I'm lost. He had watched her walk away, the sound of her footsteps fading into the cold distance. He had never seen her again. Not after that. That moment, that decision to let her go, had shattered something inside of him. The pain had become an old friend, one he carried with him every day, silently, never asking for attention. But now, as he sat there, watching the boy in his coat, the memory felt different. No longer a sharp, jagged thing, but a dull ache, a wound that had healed, but never quite closed. Over the course of the following weeks, Thomas found himself thinking more about Elena, the coat, the boy, their brief conversation. They had all unlocked something buried deep within him, something he hadn't known he was ready to face. The memories of their time together, the way Elena had made him feel alive, had slowly crept back into his life, like flowers pushing through the frozen ground after a long winter. Thomas realized, as the days turned into weeks, that he had been living in the shadow of his own grief. He had built walls around himself, constructed a life that was safe, predictable, and empty. He had forgotten what it meant to truly live, to allow himself to feel the pain, the joy, the sorrow, and the beauty of the world. But the boy, the stranger who wore Elena's coat, had reminded him of something vital. Living wasn't about avoiding pain. It was about accepting it, letting it flow through you, and finding a way to move forward, even if just an inch at a time. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange, Thomas found himself walking toward the bench where the boy always sat. He hadn't planned to, he hadn't meant to, but his feet carried him there, as though his body knew the way even when his mind was uncertain. The boy was already there, staring out at the snow-covered park, his coat wrapped tightly around him. For a moment, Thomas stood there, watching him in silence. The weight of the past pressed heavily on his chest, but there was no longer the sharp pain, the suffocating grief. There was simply peace. It was fragile, fleeting, but it was there. "Do you still miss her?" the boy asked suddenly, his voice breaking the stillness between them. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, but Thomas knew the question wasn't casual. The boy was looking for something, some answer he hadn't yet found. Thomas hesitated. He hadn't expected the boy to ask such a direct question, but it felt like the right moment to speak. "Yes," he said quietly. "I miss her every day. But I think that's okay." The boy nodded as though he understood. He didn't need to hear more. He didn't need a long explanation or a confession. Sometimes, the simple acknowledgement of a shared truth was enough. For the first time in years, Thomas didn't feel as though he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. It wasn't that the grief had disappeared. He knew it never would. But in that moment, sitting beside this boy who had unwittingly helped him confront the past, Thomas felt a sense of release. He had let go, even if just for a second. And in that moment, that second, he found a glimpse of the life he had forgotten. A life that included pain, but also love, hope, and the possibility of moving forward. The boy stood up, stretching his arms out, and smiled. "You know," he said, "I think we're all just trying to find our way in the end." Thomas smiled back, a soft, wistful smile. "Yes, I think you're right." And as the boy walked away, disappearing into the gathering night, Thomas stayed on the bench for a while longer. He watched the last traces of daylight fade into the twilight, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the smallest stirrings of peace, a feeling that had once seemed impossible to reach. In the days that followed, Thomas continued to visit the park, sitting on the same bench. He never saw the boy again, but somehow it didn't matter. The boy had left something behind, something intangible, a lesson that would stay with him forever. The memories of Elena, the loss, the love, all of it had become a part of him, woven into the fabric of his life. And though he would carry it with him always, he no longer felt burdened by it. The coat, the boy, the days that had passed, they had helped him understand that it was okay to live with the pain, to let the memories linger, but not let them define him. Life was not about forgetting the past. It was about learning to live alongside it. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was enough. The Winter Coat, Part 5, Connecting the Fragments. It was early spring when the first real warmth came, the kind that makes the earth feel alive again, pushing away the last traces of winter's chill. Thomas sat on the same bench in the park, his mind far away from the ordinary humdrum of the day. He hadn't seen the boy for weeks now, but the feeling of their brief moments together lingered in him, persistent and subtle. His life had continued its quiet rhythm, but something within him had shifted. That morning, as he walked toward the park, he found himself thinking about Elena again. The smell of her perfume on the coat, the way her laughter had once filled the air like music. The memories had been sharp and painful at first, but over time they had softened, fading into something he could carry with a quiet grace. The realization had come to him slowly. He had never really let go of Elena, not entirely. She was still with him, in the way he moved through the world, in the way he loved and lost, in the way he kept the coat hidden in the back of his closet, its fabric a faint echo of what once was. Sitting there, watching the gentle breeze ruffle the branches of the trees overhead, Thomas realized that the memories of Elena weren't just a weight. They were a part of him, a part that he had neglected for so long. The coat, which had once been a symbol of the heartbreak and the void she had left behind, had transformed. It had come to represent something else, a connection, not just to the past, but to something larger, something more profound. It was not about holding on to what had been, but about honoring it, learning from it, and finally accepting it. The connection between the boy and the coat, between the past and the present, became clearer as the days unfolded. He had never really understood why the boy had shown up in his life at such a moment. It was as though fate had pulled the strings, weaving their paths together at just the right moment. But now, as Thomas sat alone on the park bench, the pieces of his life seemed to fall into place. The boy had been more than a messenger or a reminder of Elena's absence. He had been a catalyst for a kind of reckoning Thomas hadn't realized he needed. The first time Thomas had seen the boy in the park, he had been so caught up in his own sorrow, so focused on the emptiness that seemed to consume him, that he hadn't even truly seen the boy. He had been a silhouette, a stranger in a threadbare coat. But now, with time to reflect, Thomas realized that the boy was carrying a piece of his own grief, too. A boy who had known loss, who had worn the very coat that had once been Elena's, had in some strange way shared that loss with him. It was as if the boy had walked through the same darkness, found his own way through it, and had come out the other side. The connection between them was clear now. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to feel the full weight of that understanding. He could no longer view the boy as just an enigma, a figure who had appeared in his life for a brief moment, and then disappeared without explanation. No, the boy had left an imprint on his soul. More than that, the boy had shown him something, the ability to accept the past, to forgive it, and to move forward. The boy had shown him that it wasn't about forgetting. It was about accepting the loss and embracing the life that still awaited. In his mind, Thomas replayed the moment when the boy had asked him if he still missed Elena. That question had cut through him in a way he hadn't expected. It had forced him to confront the truth, to admit that the hurt still lived within him, but that it was no longer something he needed to carry as a burden. Elena's departure had never been about her absence. It had always been about how he had failed to let go. He had kept her with him, in the way he couldn't shake the memories, in the way he kept things that reminded him of her, like that coat. But now, with the boy's presence in his life, Thomas saw a way forward. He saw the possibility of healing. It wasn't an easy path, and it wasn't going to be quick, but he could finally begin to move toward the future. The boy had taught him that the past could be a teacher, not a prison. And with that realization, Thomas stood up from the bench, feeling lighter than he had in years. He made his way to the small apartment where he lived, taking slow, deliberate steps as if the very act of walking had become a meditation. When he arrived at his door, he took a deep breath, his hand resting on the doorknob. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of purpose. He was ready to face the things he had hidden away, to let them be a part of him without letting them control him. It was a strange feeling, one that he hadn't known in a long time, but it was also a welcome one. Inside, he made his way to the closet where the coat still hung, just as it had all those years. The faded fabric, the deep red hue, the patch on the sleeve, everything about it was still there, unchanged. But Thomas saw it differently now. He didn't feel anger, nor did he feel sadness. He simply saw the coat for what it was, a part of his journey, a memory that could now be put to rest, not forgotten, but released. For a long while, he simply stood there, looking at the coat, allowing himself to feel all the emotions that had been tied to it: love, loss, regret, and forgiveness. And when he finally took the coat from its place in the closet, he didn't feel the need to hide it away anymore. He didn't feel the need to carry it as a burden. He simply allowed it to be, and in that act, he felt something break inside him. A fracture, yes, but a healing one. Thomas walked the window, where the evening light streamed in, casting soft shadows across the floor. He held the coat in his arms, just as he had once held Elena, and for the first time, he didn't feel as though he was losing her all over again. Instead, he felt a quiet acceptance. The past and the present had finally connected in a way that made sense. The fragment of his life, the boy, the coat, Elena, had all found their place in the story he was still writing, and he could finally see the beauty in that. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Thomas knew that he could now move forward. He wasn't defined by his grief, but by the way he had chosen to live with it. The boy in the park, the coat, the memories, they were all a part of him. And in that realization, Thomas found the peace he had been searching for all along. The Winter Coat, Part 6, Open Endings. The days drifted by, like leaves carried on a wind, slow and unpredictable. Thomas had come to terms with the past in ways he hadn't thought possible. His grief, which once felt like a weight too heavy to bear, had lightened, transformed into something more like an old friend, an old wound that no longer bled but left a mark. The boy, the coat, Elena, they had all played their parts in a story that was still unfolding, even if the pages had begun to turn more quietly now. Life continued in small, unremarkable ways. The weather grew warmer, spring pushing through the cracks of winter's grip. Flowers bloomed in the park, and the once barren trees began to show signs of life. And yet, there was something unspoken that lingered in the air, a sense that everything was connected, that nothing had truly ended, that the past and the present still danced together in some silent rhythm, just beneath the surface. One evening, as Thomas sat in his small living room, the coat resting across the back of his chair, he found himself thinking about the boy again. He had thought about him often, wondering who he was, what had brought him into his life at such a crucial moment. The boy had vanished, just as mysteriously as he had appeared, leaving Thomas with nothing but the memory of their brief encounters and the strange sense that they had shared something significant. He stood up, moved to the window, and looked out at the familiar streets. It was a quiet night, the sky darkening slowly, stars beginning to flicker in the heavens. For the first time in a long while, Thomas didn't feel the pull of his past, the ache of loss that had once seemed all-consuming. It had receded, not gone, but softened, part of the landscape of his life now, rather than the storm that had once torn him apart. As he watched the street below, a figure caught his eye. A boy, about the same age as the one he had met, walked down the sidewalk, his coat wrapped tightly around him, the same way the boy had worn Elena's coat. Thomas's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the same boy. It couldn't be. But there was something familiar about the way he moved, something hauntingly reminiscent of those early days when everything had been so raw. The boy walked with purpose, his footsteps steady, as if the way of the world had already shaped him in ways Thomas couldn't fully understand. For a moment, Thomas felt as if time had folded in on itself. Was this boy part of the same story? Could it be possible that the threads of the past had somehow woven themselves into the present once again? Thomas didn't know. He couldn't say for sure. But there was something about this new boy, this stranger, that made him pause. Perhaps, in some strange way, the boy was an echo, a reminder, or maybe even a continuation of the journey he had already begun. He felt a stirring within him, a subtle sense of recognition. But as quickly as the feeling had come, it faded. The boy walked past his window, heading down the street, his coat fluttering slightly in the breeze. Thomas stood there for a moment longer, watching, before he turned away. He didn't follow the boy, didn't try to stop him. The world had a way of unfolding on its own terms, and perhaps it was enough simply to be present, to witness the ebb and flow of life, without trying to control it. The coat remained on the chair behind him, the memories of Elena and the boy woven into its fabric. But Thomas didn't feel the need to hold on to them anymore. He had learned that letting go didn't mean forgetting. It meant accepting. The coat, once a symbol of his loss, was now just a piece of cloth, a reminder of who he had been and who he had become. And in that quiet realization, Thomas knew that he could continue to move forward, even if the road ahead was still unclear. The seasons would change again, as they always did, and Thomas would keep walking through life, carrying the lessons of the past with him, but no longer weighed down by them. Whether he would ever see the boy again or not, whether the story would continue in ways he couldn't predict, he didn't know. But perhaps that was the point. Life, like the coat, was always changing, always shifting, never quite the same as it had been before. As the boy disappeared into the night, Thomas sat back down, letting the quiet of the evening settle around him. He thought of Elena, of the boy, of the years that had passed, and he realized that it didn't matter whether the story was finished or not. What mattered was that it was still as to tell, still unfolding one small moment at a time. The end? Perhaps. But maybe, just maybe, it was only the beginning.